Today's stories do contain some disturbing subject matter and viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com, click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. I used to work the late shift for a drugstore that was open until 1 in the morning, and I hated every second of it. It was not a fun job, but it paid my bills and kept me fed, so despite disliking it, I did it for several years. My duties were super simple. Run the register, help the customers, stock the shelves. Nothing too crazy. Well, minus the photo desk. We all hated the photo desk. One night, I was sitting behind my register helping people check out and yawning every 3 or 4 minutes because I was tired as all get out. I remember my manager Phil came over to me and told me that he needed me for a second, which was never a good thing. Phil was a gruff guy, super monotone and emotionless, but he was an okay manager. Usually when he said he needed to talk to someone, it was to reprimand them, and I assumed he was going to get on to me for yawning or something, but he didn't. He pointed toward the wall mirrors where we could see a young woman standing. She was small, probably not even 5 foot, and thinner than what I would say is healthy. I watched her in the mirrors and noticed that something definitely seemed off. She was a bit too twitchy, if that makes sense. He made a comment about keeping an eye on her because he had a bad feeling. I tried to act casual as I watched her, glancing over at her, sneaking quick looks to see if I could catch her doing something. She seemed incredibly nervous, and was darting around to different aisles, seemingly at random, doing her best to keep her back to us. Phil was definitely right. Something was up. A few minutes later, the woman made her way over to my register, holding nothing more than a 2-liter of Pepsi. I stared at the soda and then looked at her. Her hair was wiry and her eyes looked nothing short of empty. She had very dark circles around them. She looked more tired than I did. Before I finished ringing up her one item, Phil walked out of one of the aisles and approached the woman with his arms crossed. He said, "Hey, I saw you put that makeup in your pocket. You need to either pay for it or leave it on the counter." I remember that his voice was loud, and it echoed, which is probably the most emotive I had literally ever seen Phil. Instantly, things turned from mundane to absolute chaos. The woman shook her head no at him aggressively. Phil reached his arm out to grab her bag. Admittedly, this is something that we were told not to do, but Phil was my manager, and I wasn't going to tell him to stop. As soon as he reached his arm out, this woman lunged at him and sank her teeth straight into his forearm. Phil screamed in pain and surprise, trying to pull his arm back, but she kept her grip on him for several more seconds. She then released him, let out what I can only call a bone-chilling screech, and bolted out the door into the darkness. Phil staggered back, clutching his now bleeding arm and staring at me like, what the hell was that? It was a gruesome sight. He was bleeding really bad, and you could clearly see the imprint of her teeth. I remember that I started feeling nauseous while staring at him. I called 911 immediately. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the phone. The paramedics arrived in only a few minutes, and they rushed over to Phil to wrap his arm to stop the bleeding, and they said that they needed to get him checked out and tested because there was a chance that she could have given him a disease. The police also arrived, asking me what happened. I almost wanted to tell them that Phil was bitten by patient 0 and that we were about to witness the damn zombie apocalypse. That's how surreal it all felt. Honestly, who expects a woman to bite someone over some stolen drugstore makeup? They took a look around, made some notes, asked about camera footage and all that, but I think they were as baffled as I was about this whole thing. Phil ended up needing stitches to patch his arm up, and I'm sure they had to give him a rabies shot too, just in case. Poor guy was incredibly shaken up about the whole incident, but can you blame him? After that night, he was a lot nicer to people, which I guess is the silver lining to having your arm ripped into by some crazy woman. And me? I was left with a creepy story and a new disdain for the night shift. Oh, and I avoided the cosmetic aisle at all costs, just in case. And though I've moved on from that job, the memory of that night, the visual of her latching onto him, and that horrifying screech that she let out before running away, it all still sends major shivers down my spine. I have a story that happened to me back in the mid-90s. I was a pimple-faced 19-year-old college kid, trying to figure out what I was doing with my life, and at the time I was working at a medium-sized department store, one that doesn't really exist anymore, that rhymed with the word cheers. The store was outdated, even back in the 90s, and those of us that worked registers and customer service were severely limited on what we could do for customers. And honestly, I hated that job, so I wasn't very willing to go above and beyond for people. The day that it happened, it was a pretty normal day. I clocked in at 8 and was assigned to the customer service desk, and was then immediately told that we were short that day, and that I was going to be working the desk the entire 8 hours, and that there was only the one manager, so to not even bother calling for a CSM. That's customer service manager for those that don't know. I don't remember what I was doing at that exact moment, but a customer walked over to the desk. A burly and rugged-looking dude with hair that looked like an absolute mess, and an incredibly sour look on his face. I asked him how I could help him, and he pulled a pair of sneakers from a plastic bag and slammed them down on the counter, saying, "I want to return these." These shoes were gross, and I'm not even sure that we sold them at my store. I stared at the shoes for a moment and then looked back at the man and asked if he'd had a receipt for them. That's where things started to take a turn for the worse. He aggressively said, "Hell no, I don't have the receipt." I explained as politely as I could that I couldn't process the return unless he had the receipt for them. I wasn't lying. There was literally nothing that I could do without the information on the transaction. Nowadays, stores can track your purchases in other ways, but back then, it was receipts, or you were SOL. The man started shouting at me, causing another customer that was in line to flinch and look a bit panicked. "You're gonna take them back, one way or another." I told him again that there was literally nothing that I could do at all to process the return unless he had a receipt. I tried to keep myself calm and tried to not match his hostility or volume, but he was starting to throw a tantrum. It was unnerving. He was screaming at the top of his lungs about how he needed the money and that he had just bought the shoes there the day before. Which, no, he did not. Unless he had bought them and then ran several miles through mud and wet concrete. He finally wrapped up his fit by pointing a finger right in my face and yelling, "You're gonna regret this!" He then turned and stormed out of the store, leaving the gross shoes on the counter. I wrapped them in a plastic bag and placed them behind the counter just in case he came back for them. I was a bit shaken by the end of that, but I was relieved that he decided to just threaten me and leave, instead of taking action. The rest of the day passed pretty quickly and without incident. I'd moved on from the crazy shoe man and just continued helping others with their returns and whatnot. It was reaching towards the end of my shift, and I was tiredly doing what I needed to do, just looking forward to being able to going home, when I heard a loud smashing sound, followed by the screams of shocked customers. This was followed by the visual of smoke starting to billow through the aisles, and the air starting to slowly get warmer. I rushed toward the sound with my heart pounding, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. Near the front of the store, there was a blazing fire starting to spread, and it was very quickly burning its path into some of the merchandise. The fire alarm was going off, and people were running out the front door to get away from the blaze. I ran back to the counter and grabbed the fire extinguisher, and I tried my best to douse the fire with the foam, but it didn't do jack. Every bit that I put out was replaced with fire catching on more and more of the shelves and clothing, until the extinguisher eventually sputtered out. I stood there for a second and watched as this fire just covered more and more of the floor, and for some reason I felt like I needed to do something to stop it, but was quickly brought back to reality when I heard my manager shouting my name and yelling at me to get out of the building. I did what she said, and I ran over to the front door and started ushering customers out of the building, telling them to get as far away as they could and to stay calm. Thankfully, the fire department arrived quickly, and they were on it. They moved in as fast as they could, blasted the whole thing with water, and after a little while, they were able to get the fire put out, and get the whole thing contained and secured. After they had finished their job, my manager and I went back in, and the store was an absolute disaster. Everything in the store was either charred or completely saturated. The police had arrived and started asking my manager some questions, mostly because the fire looked incredibly suspicious, having started in the clothing section. We all went to the back where the camera system was, probably the only thing in the store that wasn't antiquated. All of us watched the entryway camera for when this all started, and much to my surprise, I watched as the man from earlier that wanted to return his shoes walked in the door, lit a cloth that was in a glass bottle, and heaved it as hard as he could into the store, and then bolted back out into the parking lot. This guy had come back with a damn Molotov and threw it in an occupied store because I wouldn't accept his dirty shoes. I told the officers about the encounter. I told them that he was going off on me and that he had threatened me a few hours before. They took my statement, took the camera footage from earlier, and the footage that showed him throwing the Molotov, and left to further their search. Thankfully, they didn't have to go very far. This guy was hiding out at the IHOP next door to the store. Before they left, they were flagged down by one of the waiters that was outside of the restaurant. He told them that just after the fire had started, a guy came into the restaurant reeking of gasoline, and said that he wanted a table in the corner. Apparently the guy was just sitting in the IHOP, watching the chaos unfold through the window, and giggling to himself. Worst yet, he was still there when the cops went in. They approached him. He started yelling that he had been there for the last 2 hours, and that he had nothing to do with it. Of course, he was wearing the same clothes, and still smelled of gasoline, so they knew that it was him. In the end, he was hauled off and charged with some pretty serious stuff. He caused thousands of dollars in damage, and our store was shut down for quite a while. I took that time to find a job at a warehouse, because that was the last day that I wanted to work with people, and, to be honest, I haven't worked retail ever since. I've heard a few people on here talk about some really crazy stuff that happened to them while they were working retail, so I thought I would throw my hat in the ring. I used to work at a small grocery store chain for a few years. Typical 9 to 5 work in the produce department, carved out in a little corner at the front of the store. At this job, and I assume most others, you get 2 15-minute breaks and a lunch in between, which was 30 minutes at this place. I know, criminal. We could take our breaks outside, but you couldn't leave the property because you were still clocked in, unless you were on lunch. So, typically, on the nice summer days, most of us wanted to take our breaks outside. There wasn't a designated sitting area or a set of tables and chairs. We were just a storefront at the end of a bigger string of stores, so there really wasn't anywhere to put them anyways. So normally we would just sit out on the little concrete lip coming off the wall, off the building on the sidewalk. After working for a few hours, I decided to take my first 15, so I told my manager, took off my apron, bought a snack at the checkout, and went outside to get some air. When I got outside, I leaned up against the wall and ate my snack, just listening to the cars and the people, trying to clear my head before going back in. This large woman walks up next to me and just kind of stares at me for a minute. I look over at her, and she's just standing there mumbling and staring right at me. I look away, trying to act like I wasn't bothered by it, which I totally was. After about another minute of this, she just turns around and walks away. Feeling relieved, I didn't want to wait for her to come back, as I had 5 minutes left on my break, so I decided to cut it short and head in early. Later on in the day, I'm stocking the fruits and veggies, and I noticed the same woman walking around in the store, looking around in a daze. No shopping cart or bags, not looking at any products or even people. She was just wandering around like she wasn't in the middle of a busy grocery store on a Saturday afternoon. I told my manager about her and how she kind of just stared at me outside, but he said we couldn't do anything unless she was making people uncomfortable or decided to steal something. So I went about the next few hours like normal until my lunch break hit. I'd forgotten about the woman and my brief encounter in the morning. I ordered a slice of pizza over the phone and went next door to pick it up, and as I'm walking to my usual outside sitting spot, I noticed the same woman standing there, staring at the wall where I was earlier. I decided the AC was nicer than the outside heat anyways, and I took my lunch inside. Inside of our store, there are a set of tables and booths in a medium-sized section of wine and beer, just kind of in the middle of the store. It's pretty cozy. It's not good to get away from people, and in hindsight, I should have just went to the break room in the back. As I'm sitting there eating my pizza and sipping on my Coke, I was in the middle of a YouTube video with both headphones in, and I see at the very top of my vision a big figure slide into the booth across from me. I quickly look up and then back down at my phone. It was the same woman from earlier, and she was just staring daggers into my soul. I decided enough was enough. This was getting ridiculous. We're in the middle of a store, so what was she going to do? I took out my earbuds. "Can I help you?" She replies with just mumbles. "Listen, you following me around is making me feel really uncomfortable, so can you tell me what you want?" Just like that, I watched her eyes finally focus on me and actually see me for the first time. She must have been totally out of it. "I just need a ride home. I've been stuck here all day." She said this in such a deadpan, monotone way that it was like she was reading it off of a script. "Sorry, I don't have a car. My uncle comes to pick me up after work." She then starts acting erratic, rocking back and forth, I could give you, no, him, gas money. Please? Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I decided to get up and take my lunch to the break room, apologizing to the lady and just quickly walking away. As I get to the double doors leading to the dairy back room and the break room, I push one of them open and my manager is just coming out. I was just about to tell him what happened when his face turns into one of confusion, and he says something to someone behind me. "Ma'am, you can't be back here. Employees only." I turn around and, to my horror, there she was again, standing there in a daze and staring straight at me, not even acknowledging my manager and trying to follow me into the back room. He gets her away from the double doors, and I usher him over and I tell him what's going on. He told me that he'll get her out of there and not to worry. Relieved, I went to the break room and finished my lunch. Then my second break, and then the second half of my shift without so much as a hiccup, aside from the regular 9 to 5 BS. So, as I mentioned before, I told the lady that my uncle would be coming to pick me up, which was true. What I didn't tell her is that he would be late today by about half an hour or so. So, I was just going to go to the GameStop next door, browse for a bit, and hop in the car and hightail it out of there hoping that she wouldn't see me. As I exit the store, I turn to where my usual spot on the sidewalk is, and there she is again. Same spot, 8 hours later. But this time she's looking right at me, like she knew that I was coming. I quickly turned around and speed-walked to GameStop, hoping that I could get there in time before she got to me. I knew the people in there very well. We were basically friends at this point, so I knew that they would help me. I rush into the store, and the lady at the counter saw the look on my face and asked me what was wrong. I told her that a woman had been stalking me since I got into work that day. She immediately ushered me to sit behind some boxes in the counter. A few seconds later, the door chime went off, and someone came in the store. The lady behind the counter asked me what she looked like, and I told her. She then turned and asked the person who came in if they needed any help. "Nah, I'm just waiting for my boyfriend." Her what? So this lady follows me around all day, stalks me, makes me uncomfortable, and then calls me her boyfriend? I sat there for what felt like hours, and then finally the door chime went off again and she left. I stayed there for a few more minutes just to make sure she was gone. When the lady was sure that I was safe, she told me the coast was clear. Just then, my uncle pulled up outside, and I hopped in as fast as I could. I looked around as we were driving away, and I saw the lady in that same spot from earlier just staring at the wall. A few weeks later, I actually saw an arrest warrant on Facebook from my local police department. My heart dropped as I saw the picture of the same lady with that same blank stare. She was apparently wanted for robbery and attempted assault. I'm so thankful for that lady at GameStop and my manager because I have no idea what would have happened to me if they weren't there. I used to work in one of those big department stores back in the mid-2010s. I stocked shelves and sometimes had to work in the front, but I was mostly assigned with processing returns and doing the overnight stocking. While it was mostly uneventful, there is one event that I have never been able to forget, mostly because I have no idea how it turned out, and it was seriously kind of creepy. This happened when I was part of the crew that was doing inventory. I don't know if you've ever worked an inventory for a retail location, but it is hell. You have to spend way too much time literally counting items on shelves. Every little item on every single shelf has to be counted and tallied, so that the store knows how much of what they have, and they can further decide if certain departments have issues with theft. I had to do the inventory of the toy section of the store, which, again, is full of small items. So my brain was feeling a bit burned out. Every Lego, every little blind box, every single Hot Wheel. As I reached up to grab one of the items from one of the top shelves, my hand accidentally knocked down a plush bear. I instinctually went to catch it, but fumbled it, and it fell straight to the floor. But instead of that soft flump sound that you would expect, it made a bit of a hard thud. Weird, right? It was a basic stuffed bear. There was nothing inside of it but fluff, and yet it made a hard sound as if it was heavy. I picked it up, and it was heavier than I anticipated. Something about it was definitely off. I looked closer at the bear, trying to figure out what exactly was off about him, when I noticed something unusual about his eyes. One of them was pretty standard, but the other one was different. It looked like it had a hole in it that was shiny and reflective. After a moment of looking at it closely, it clicked. That weird eye? It wasn't just an eye. The hole was for a lens. The lens of a small, hidden camera, recording everything. I dropped the bear like it was going to burst into flames. My heart was pounding as I thought about the possibilities. Who puts a camera in a toy bear? Why was it recording? How did they get it into the store like that? And, most importantly, what had it seen? I grabbed it and immediately took it to my manager's office, trying to keep my composure. I explained to him that there was a camera in the bear, and at first he didn't believe me, but when I handed it to him and he looked it over, his face turned from confusion to shock. He found it hard to believe, but the more that he examined it, it really did click. He grabbed a letter opener from his desk and pulled the threads off of the head of the bear, and, sure enough, there was a camera that was attached to the inside of the bear's head. He contacted the authorities, and an officer showed up to ask what was going on. We explained that it looked like someone had snuck a hidden camera into the store, and that it was in an item that was on the shelf to be sold. I think that's the part that bothered me the most. This camera was in a product that someone could have taken home and given to their child. I don't know if the camera had any sort of remote connection or something. I know literally nothing about technology like that, but just the possibility put a knot in my stomach. They took the bear, and we had to pause inventory on the toy section so that we could check all of the other stuffed animals and see if any of them had a camera. But that was the only one, thankfully. There was obviously the concern that we could have sold one that had a camera, and I'm sure the store went through the proper channels for that, contacting customers and whatnot, but I don't know whatever came of it. Maybe it was just a sick prank, but there's a possibility that this was some creep trying to get a camera into someone's home. Obviously, there was a bit of tension at work when I had to continue doing my inventory on the toy section. I kept looking at the stuffed animals and thinking about it because it really bothered me. Even now, all these years later, I actually cannot stand the sight of teddy bears, as they always remind me of that night. Hi, Raven. You're my favorite horror narrator, and I hope that you use my story in one of your videos. I work in retail. It wasn't my first choice, but the pay is okay and my boss is surprisingly decent. I work in one of those antique stores in a small town. Most people know each other in my town, enough to know who everyone is and their names. We even have some regular out-of-town people who drop by to see what we have in store, and they go to the local cafes. Most of our industry is now based around tourism, and a super busy tourist season. I was doing some dusting of some of the shelves when I heard the bell. "I'll be right over," I called out, and I saw an older-looking woman with bleach blonde hair and that stereotypical Karen haircut. She had that irritated look, even though nothing had even happened yet. I'm not going to judge someone based on looks, but I smiled at her and asked if there was anything I could help her with. She looked me up and down like I wasn't worth her time, rolled her eyes, and asked where we kept the expensive items that were actually worth looking at. I asked her if she had anything specific in mind. Maybe jewelry, furniture, or something that could help me. She then asked me if I was stupid and if I had mental deficiencies. I told her no and that I wanted to help her. She asked to speak to my boss and told me that she knew the owner. And if I didn't end up giving her a discount, she was going to get me fired from my job. This was an incredible overreaction. I nearly didn't bother calling him over, but I picked up the phone from behind the desk, and Bob, the owner, came out. He was a nice person, but he got really cranky when he was disturbed for no reason. She smiled at him. It was so fake. And she told him that I had been rude to her and therefore she felt a discount was in order. He raised his eyebrows and looked at me. I was about to answer when he put his hand up. He told her that he had heard every single word and asked if she wished to proceed with her complaint. She looked like a fish gulping for air at that point. I had to resist the urge to burst out laughing. I wish I remembered exactly what he'd said and the way that he said it, but basically it was along the lines of, "I don't know you, and I've never met you, ma'am. However, I'd like to think that my friends would never treat a 17-year-old employee with that disrespect. Please, find somewhere else to take your money." She ranted and raved like a child. He told her that if she broke anything, she would have to pay for the items. Now, I've never actually seen a Karen before, so this was quite the experience. We had a laugh about it, and by the end of the day, all of our regulars knew, and therefore the whole town learned of the Karen adventures. No secrets in a small town and all that. But that wasn't the end of the whole affair. Oh no. She left negative reviews, and made new accounts, and left even more. She drove back to the store and handed out pamphlets to any customers about how terrible we were. It was bizarre. My boss was more amused by the whole thing than angry. None of the customers had time for her, and all she did was scream at them and throw more tantrums. At this point, I almost felt sorry for her. Why would you waste your time doing all of this and not just move on with your life? When my boss went out to ask her to move on, she came at him, screaming and punching him. I went out and I pulled her off of him. She was screeching and flailing her arms, telling us that she was going to destroy us. It was freaking unhinged. I could barely stop her. One of the townies managed to get her down on the ground. She was screaming to be let go and that she has rights. It was kind of hard to follow what all was said by her. The sheriff was called and she was arrested, and yes, it was the talk of my town for months afterwards. And we never found out what happened to her. The town laughs about her every now and then. Hey, remember that crazy lady who came into Bob's place? Bob was okay, thankfully. He had a bruise and would joke sometimes about his war wound for the store. He even got some sales out of it, so he was more than happy. Every once in a while, we will get another bad review that sounds like it was written by her, but honestly, there's a lot of crazy in this world. So that, my friends, was a collection of some creepy retail stories. Definitely some good stories in this one. It's been a minute since I've done a retail collection. I don't remember what the last one had in its stories, but I can definitely say that these all felt rather, different than those ones. Yeah, good stories. Working retail is not fun. I've worked numerous retail jobs in my life. I worked for Blockbuster, and that was a job, I guess. Made minimum wage and worked minimum hours. Barely was able to pay my phone bill and for gas, but it's irrelevant. I worked restaurants, and that's actually it. I haven't worked any, like, big name stores, big name stores, whatever. I haven't worked any of those. My other half, Patience, she worked at Walmart for a long time. And strangely enough, she didn't hate the job, but she also didn't love the job. She was one of those people that just kind of accepted it for what it was and didn't try to pretend it was anything more than what it was. So I think that's a big thing about retail. If you can tamper your expectations, the job goes just fine. Right? But I don't know. I don't think it's anything I could do ever again. Though who knows, maybe someday I'll have to, right? We'll see. We'll see how the future goes, my friends. Anyways, that was a collection of retail stories. Hopefully you enjoyed them. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. That would mean a lot to me. You can also leave a comment down below letting me know if you've ever worked retail, what stores you worked for, and what you thought of it. Or any other comments you may want to leave, of course. There's also Patreon and memberships where you get early access to content like this and other content. And other things depending on what you sign up for and how you sign up. And there's the super thanks, which is a tip to the channel, never ever expected, but always, always appreciated. That said, friends, I need some water, so I hope you have a beautiful day. I hope I do see you here very soon. I promise you I'll be back here very soon. Probably tomorrow. Yeah. Till then, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Don't forget it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And of course, till I see you again, my friends, much love, and sleep well.